The clatter of silverware stopped mid-bite as Kevin's voice cut through our family's Thanksgiving dinner like a blade. "Mom, you're being completely senile about this. Face it. You're just a worthless old woman who doesn't understand how the real world works anymore." 23 people sat frozen around my mahogany dining table, the same table where we'd shared gratitude for 25 years. My homemade cranberry sauce suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth as I looked into the cold eyes of my firstborn son, the child I'd sacrificed everything to raise and educate. But Kevin had no idea that while he was busy counting his inheritance chickens, I'd already moved the entire coop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though most folks in Cedar Falls call me Maggie. At 67, I've lived through enough seasons to know the difference between a temporary storm and a fundamental change in weather. For 30 years, I served as principal of Cedar Falls Elementary, watching generations of children grow from uncertain kindergartners into confident young adults. After I retired 8 years ago, following my husband Robert's sudden passing from a heart attack, I discovered I had a gift for helping families navigate their financial futures. I became a certified financial planner, spending my golden years ensuring other people's children wouldn't fight over money when their parents were gone. What I didn't anticipate was that my own son would become the exact type of person I'd spent years warning my clients about. Kevin had always been my challenging child. Where his sister Linda inherited my practical nature and his brother David got his father's gentle heart, Kevin seemed to absorb only the worst qualities from both sides of our family tree. He had my stubborn determination without my wisdom, and his father's ambition without Robert's integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the last decade helping other families prevent exactly the kind of dysfunction that was now playing out in my own dining room. Every estate plan I'd crafted, every family meeting I'd facilitated, every bitter inheritance dispute I'd helped resolve had taught me valuable lessons about human nature and money. I'd seen how the promise of inheritance could transform loving children into calculating strangers, how entitlement could poison relationships that had taken decades to build. Cedar Falls had been my home for 43 years, ever since Robert and I moved here as newlyweds. We'd bought our colonial revival house on Maple Street when it was just a tired old place with good bones and big dreams. Together, we'd restored every room, planted every tree in the yard, and raised our 3 children within these walls. After Robert's funeral, well-meaning friends suggested I might want to downsize, move to one of those senior communities in Waterloo or Cedar Rapids. But this house held too many memories, too much of our shared history. Besides, I wasn't ready to be put out to pasture just yet. The farmland had come from my side of the family, 160 acres of some of the richest soil in Iowa. My great-grandfather had homesteaded it in 1885, and it had passed down through 4 generations of careful stewardship. When my parents died within 6 months of each other 12 years ago, I inherited not just the land, but the responsibility that came with it. Robert and I had leased it to the Hendrickson family, local farmers who treated it with the respect it deserved. The annual lease payments, combined with my pension and the life insurance from Robert's death, meant I was financially comfortable in ways my Depression-era parents could never have imagined. Kevin, however, had been making assumptions about his financial future since the day we buried his father. At the funeral lunch, while his siblings were still red-eyed with grief, Kevin had cornered me near the casserette table to discuss what he called the transition of family assets. He spoke in the calculated tones of someone who'd been thinking about this conversation for far too long. Even then, I'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Over the years that followed, Kevin's sense of entitlement had grown like a weed in fertile soil. He'd made comments about when I inherit the farm at family gatherings, spoken of his future plans for my land to anyone who would listen, and even brought potential business partners to family events to show off what he clearly considered his birthright. His wife Jessica enabled this behavior, often chiming in with her own assumptions about their future wealth. Their children, Tyler and Madison, had grown up hearing their parents discuss Grandma's money as if it were already theirs. What Kevin didn't know was that I'd been documenting every dismissive comment, every assumption, every moment when he'd shown more interest in my net worth than my well-being. As someone who'd spent years helping families navigate these exact dynamics, I recognized the warning signs of what my profession called inheritance impatience. I'd seen it destroy families, turn siblings into enemies, and leave elderly parents feeling like nothing more than inconvenient obstacles to their children's financial plans. The Thanksgiving that changed everything had started like all the others. Linda had driven up from Minneapolis with her husband Angela and their 2 young children. David had flown in from Chicago with his wife Claire, both of them taking precious vacation days from their demanding careers in social work and healthcare. The house had filled with the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering, 3 generations sharing stories and laughter, while I orchestrated the complex dance of preparing. Dinner for 23 people. I'd been making Thanksgiving dinner in the same kitchen for 26 years, ever since Robert and I had moved his widowed mother in with us. The routine was as familiar as breathing. Turkey in the oven by 6 in the morning, homemade rolls. Rising on the counter, my mother's cranberry sauce recipe simmering on the back burner. The dining room table, expanded with every leaf and extension we'd collected over the years, groaned under the weight of mismatched dishes that told the story of our family's history. But this year felt different from the moment Kevin's family arrived. He'd been unusually tense, snapping at his children over minor infractions and having hushed, urgent phone conversations that he'd end abruptly whenever anyone came within earshot. Jessica seemed nervous, her usual social butterfly personality replaced by distracted anxiety. Even Tyler and Madison, typically glued to their phones, appeared subdued. The explosion came during what should have been our traditional moment of gratitude sharing. For 25 years, we'd gone around the table before carving the turkey, each person sharing something they were thankful for. It was a simple tradition, one that had produced tears of joy, fits of giggles from grandchildren, and some of my most treasured family memories. Linda had just finished talking about her gratitude for her children's health when Kevin cleared his throat aggressively. Instead of sharing his own thankfulness, he launched into what he clearly intended as a family intervention. He'd been talking to a financial advisor, he announced, and had concerns about my fiscal responsibility as I aged. In his opinion, I was making decisions that put the family's financial security at risk. The lease payments from the farm were too low, he claimed. I was being too generous with charitable donations. My lifestyle was too expensive for someone on a fixed income. The entire table fell silent as Kevin's true agenda became clear. This wasn't about gratitude or family togetherness. This was about money, pure and simple. He wanted control of the family assets now, while he was young enough to maximize their potential. In Kevin's view, I was essentially a caretaker of wealth that rightfully belonged to the next generation, and I was failing in my fiduciary duty to preserve his inheritance. When I calmly explained that my financial decisions were my own to make, that I was mentally sharp and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, Kevin's frustration boiled over into cruelty. The man who'd once been my little boy, the child I'd stayed up all night with during fevers and nightmares, looked me in the eye and called me senile and worthless. He suggested that my advanced age was making me irrational, that my decision-making capacity was compromised, and that the family needed to consider more drastic measures to protect what he kept referring to as our assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face had gone white with shock. David looked like he was going to be physically sick. Angela and Claire exchanged horrified glances while the grandchildren stared at their plates, clearly uncomfortable with the adult drama unfolding around them. Even Jessica seemed taken aback by her husband's viciousness, though she didn't speak up to defend me. But I wasn't shocked. Hurt, certainly. Disappointed beyond measure, absolutely, but not shocked. I'd been watching Kevin's character reveal itself for years, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. This moment of cruelty wasn't an aberration. It was the natural culmination of a pattern of behavior that had been building since his father's death. What Kevin didn't realize was that his outburst had just made a decision I'd been wrestling with for months incredibly easy. As I sat there, looking at my son's flushed face and calculating eyes, I felt something shift inside me. The motherly instinct to protect and provide for my children was finally overcome by the realization that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. I excused myself from the table with quiet dignity, claiming I needed to check on the dessert. Instead, I went to my home office and opened my laptop. While my family sat in uncomfortable silence around the remnants of our Thanksgiving feast, I began the process that would ensure Kevin learned the true cost of disrespecting the woman who'd given him life. Patricia Williams, my estate attorney, and friend for over 15 years, had warned me this day might come. "Maggie," she'd said during our last review of my will 6 months earlier, "I've seen this pattern before. Children who start talking about their inheritance while their parents are still healthy and sharp rarely develop more respect as time goes on. You might want to consider your options now while you have the luxury of clear thinking and emotional distance." At the time, I'd thought Patricia was being overly cautious. Surely my own son, despite his flaws, would never cross certain lines. Surely the love and sacrifice I'd poured into raising him would count for something when it really mattered. But, sitting in my quiet office while the sounds of my shattered family filtered in from the dining room, I understood that Patricia had been trying to prepare me for exactly this moment. The beautiful thing about being a financial planner is that you understand the power of documentation and legal instruments. Every decision I'd made regarding my estate had been carefully considered, properly documented, and legally bulletproof. Kevin might assume that traditional inheritance patterns and birth order gave him certain rights, but assumption and reality were about to collide in ways he'd never imagined. As I began typing the emails that would set my plan in motion, I thought about all the clients I'd counseled over the years who'd faced similar situations. I'd seen elderly parents bullied into signing over assets, manipulated into making decisions that served their children's interests rather than their own. I'd witnessed the aftermath of these power struggles, the family relationships that never recovered, the elderly who ended up financially dependent on the very children who'd shown them so little respect. That wasn't going to be my story. At 67, I was still sharp enough to manage a complex estate, still strong enough to make difficult decisions, and still dignified enough to demand the respect I'd earned through decades of sacrifice and service. If Kevin wanted to treat me like a senile old woman whose only value lay in what I might leave behind, then perhaps it was time he learned what it felt like to face his future without the safety net he'd taken for granted. The turkey was getting cold in the dining room, but I had more important things to attend to. Tomorrow was Friday, and banks would be open. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia would be in her office, as would Michael Rodriguez at First National Bank. By Monday morning, Kevin Thompson would discover that disrespecting your mother on Thanksgiving can be a very expensive mistake. But tonight, I would finish hosting. Dinner with the grace and dignity that had carried me through 30 years of dealing with difficult children, difficult parents, and difficult situations. I would serve the pumpkin pie I'd made from scratch, listen to my grandchildren's chatter about school and friends, and hug my other children goodbye with the satisfaction of knowing I'd raised 2 out of 3 good human beings. And when Kevin inevitably called to apologize for his outburst, as I knew he would once his wife and siblings made it clear how badly he'd behaved, I would accept his apology with the same grace I'd shown all evening. Because by then, the wheels would already be in motion for the most expensive lesson in respect and gratitude that Kevin Thompson would ever receive. The morning after Thanksgiving dawned gray and cold, matching my mood as I sat in my kitchen, with a cup of coffee that had grown lukewarm while I stared out at the bare maple trees lining my street. The house felt impossibly quiet after yesterday's chaos, the silence broken only by the gentle hum of my dishwasher working through the last load of holiday dishes. I'd been awake since 4:30, my mind churning through decades of memories that suddenly looked different in the harsh light of Kevin's true feelings about me. I'd always prided myself on being a woman who understood people, their motivations, and their character. 30 years as a school principal had taught me to read between the lines of what children and parents said versus what they actually meant. 8 years as a financial planner had shown me how money could reveal the deepest truths about human nature, stripping away pretense to expose raw greed, fear, and desperation. Yet somehow, I'd been blind to the transformation happening in my own son. Kevin hadn't always been this way. As I sat there nursing my coffee, I forced myself to remember the little boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who'd bring me dandelions picked from our yard as if they were precious roses. The teenager who'd cried in my arms when his girlfriend broke up with him before prom, who'd worked summers at his father's hardware store without complaint to earn money for college. Even as a young man, fresh out of Iowa State with his business degree, Kevin had shown flashes of the decent person I'd hoped he'd become. The change had been gradual, so subtle that I'd dismissed the early warning signs as normal growing pains of adulthood. It started with small comments about money during family gatherings, innocent-seeming questions about property values and investment returns. When Robert was still alive, Kevin would corner him after dinner, ostensibly seeking fatherly advice about his own finances, but always steering the conversation toward what we'd accumulated, how we'd planned for retirement, what provisions we'd made for the future. Robert, bless his generous heart, had seen these conversations as bonding opportunities with his eldest son. He'd been proud of Kevin's apparent interest in financial responsibility, pleased that our boy seemed to be thinking seriously about his own family's security. My husband had shared more information than I thought wise, walking Kevin through our investment portfolio, explaining the ins and outs of the farm lease agreements, even showing him the life insurance policies that would provide for me after Robert's death. After the funeral, Kevin's casual financial curiosity had morphed into something more focused and urgent. During the reception at our house, while I was still accepting condolences and trying to process my grief, Kevin had approached me with a manila folder full of printed articles about estate planning and tax implications of inherited property. He'd researched the current market value of Iowa farmland, calculated the potential tax burden on large inheritances, and prepared what he called a preliminary analysis of our family's financial situation. At the time, I'd been touched by what seemed like his effort to help during an overwhelming period. Losing Robert had left me feeling adrift in ways I hadn't anticipated. My husband had handled many of our financial details, and while I wasn't helpless, the prospect of managing everything, alone while grieving, felt daunting. Kevin's apparent willingness to step up and provide support had seemed like a blessing. That first year after Robert's death, Kevin had inserted himself into my financial life with what I now recognized as calculated precision. He'd accompanied me to meetings with our accountant, sat in on conversations with the bank about adjusting account structures, and volunteered to help review my investment statements each quarter. His wife, Jessica, had been equally involved, often calling to check on me during the week and casually asking about doctor's appointments, maintenance issues with the house, or whether I needed help with any paperwork. Initially, their attention had felt like genuine care and concern. As someone who'd spent decades taking care of everyone else, first as a mother and then as a school principal, being looked after felt both foreign and comforting. I'd appreciated having someone else interested in the details of property taxes and insurance premiums, grateful for Kevin's offers to handle phone calls with service providers or research better rates for various expenses. But gradually, Kevin's helpful involvement had taken on a different tone. His suggestions about my spending habits became more frequent and pointed. He questioned my charitable donations, arguing that I was being too generous with organizations that would just waste the money anyway. He criticized my decision to hire a lawn service instead of asking Tyler to mow the grass for extra spending money. He complained about my occasional trips to visit Linda in Minneapolis or David in Chicago, suggesting that travel was an unnecessary expense for someone on a limited income. The phrase limited income had become Kevin's favorite way to describe my financial situation, despite the fact that my pension, Social Security, and investment returns provided me with more monthly income than I'd ever had during my working years. He seemed determined to paint me as financially vulnerable, constantly worried about making ends meet, dependent on careful budgeting to maintain my lifestyle. This narrative bore no resemblance to my actual circumstances, but Kevin repeated it so often that I began to wonder if he'd convinced himself it was true. His concern about my spending had extended to increasingly intrusive suggestions about my living situation. Kevin regularly brought up the expense of maintaining a 4-bedroom house for one person, the rising costs of property taxes and utilities, the physical demands of home ownership for someone my age. He'd researched senior living communities in the area, printed out brochures and price lists, and made appointments for tours without consulting me first. When I gently but firmly explained that I had no intention of leaving the home I'd shared with Robert, Kevin's disappointment had been palpable. He'd argued that downsizing would free up equity that could be properly invested for my future care needs. The conversation had always circled back to maximizing the financial efficiency of my assets, never acknowledging the emotional and practical reasons I might want to stay in my own home. The pattern had become increasingly clear over the past several years. Kevin saw me not as his mother who deserved to enjoy the fruits of a lifetime of hard work, but as the custodian of wealth that would eventually belong to him. Every dollar I spent on my own comfort or pleasure was a dollar that wouldn't be part of his inheritance. Every decision I made about my property or investments was evaluated primarily in terms of how it would affect his future financial position. This perspective had colored every interaction we'd had about money, and unfortunately, money had become the dominant theme of our relationship. Kevin rarely called just to chat about family news or ask about my health and happiness. Instead, our conversations inevitably turned to practical matters like insurance coverage, maintenance expenses, or investment performance. He'd developed an encyclopedic knowledge of my financial situation that far exceeded his understanding of my interests, concerns, or daily life. The most troubling aspect of Kevin's transformation had been his growing sense of entitlement to make decisions about my affairs. What had started as offers to help had evolved into expectations that I would consult him before making any significant financial choices. When I decided to hire a financial advisor to help manage my portfolio after Robert's death, Kevin had been furious that I hadn't asked for his input on the selection process. When I'd increased my monthly donation to the local food bank, he'd lectured me about the importance of preserving assets for family members rather than giving money away to strangers. His assumption that he had a right to influence my decisions had reached its peak 6 months ago when I'd mentioned considering some updates to the kitchen. The appliances were original to the house, more than 20 years old, and beginning to show their age. I'd been thinking about replacing them with more energy-efficient models, perhaps updating the countertops at the same time. The project would have cost perhaps $15,000, well within my budget and something that would improve my daily quality of life. Kevin's reaction had been swift and harsh. He'd accused me of making impulsive decisions without considering the long-term implications. He'd questioned whether the improvements would add enough value to justify the expense, whether I really needed new appliances at my age, whether it made sense to invest in a house I might not be living in much longer. His tone had been condescending, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. That conversation had been a turning point in my understanding of our relationship. For the first time, I'd recognized that Kevin didn't see me as his mother who deserved his respect and support. Instead, he viewed me as an obstacle to his own financial goals, someone whose independent decision-making threatened his carefully laid plans for the future. The realization had been both heartbreaking and infuriating. I'd begun paying closer attention to Kevin's comments and behavior after that incident, documenting instances where he'd overstepped appropriate boundaries or revealed his true priorities. As someone trained in financial planning, I understood the importance of clear records and objective documentation. I'd started keeping a journal of our conversations, noting dates and specific quotes that illustrated his pattern of disrespectful behavior. The evidence had accumulated steadily over the months leading up to yesterday's Thanksgiving disaster. Kevin's assumption that he would inherit the family farm had become increasingly explicit in his comments to other people. He'd mentioned his future ownership of the land to his co-workers, discussed potential development opportunities with local real estate agents, and even brought business associates to family gatherings to show off what he clearly considered his property. During Labor Day weekend, Kevin had hosted a barbecue at his house and invited several couples from his social circle. I'd attended along with Linda and David's families, expecting a pleasant afternoon of food and conversation. Instead, I'd found myself listening as Kevin gave what amounted to a guided tour of his assumptions about his inheritance. He'd pointed out the farmland visible from his backyard, explaining to his guests how the property had been in our family for generations and would eventually become his responsibility to manage. The casual certainty in his voice had been chilling. Kevin hadn't said he hoped to inherit the land someday, or that he would be honored if I chose to leave it to him. Instead, he'd spoken as if the transfer was already decided, a done deal that simply awaited the formality of my death. His guests had made polite comments about the beauty of the Iowa countryside, but I'd caught the sideways glances and raised eyebrows that suggested they found Kevin's presumption as uncomfortable as I did. That evening, after the other guests had gone home, I'd attempted to have a private conversation with Kevin about his comments. I'd tried to explain gently that while I certainly hoped to leave him and his siblings a meaningful inheritance, nothing was set in stone. My estate planning decisions would depend on many factors, including my own future needs and the evolving circumstances of all my children. Kevin's response had revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement. He'd become agitated and defensive, arguing that as the eldest son, he had certain traditional expectations that should be honored. He'd reminded me of conversations with his father about the family land, claiming that Robert had promised the farm would stay in the male line of the family. He'd expressed concern that I might be influenced by modern ideas about equal inheritance that didn't respect the importance of keeping agricultural property intact. The conversation had ended badly, with Kevin storming off and Jessica making apologetic excuses for her husband's behavior. But the damage had been done. I'd seen clearly that Kevin believed he had already earned ownership of my assets simply by virtue of being my firstborn son. In his mind, my role was simply to preserve and protect his inheritance until the time came to transfer it to him. The realization that my own son viewed me primarily as a means to his financial ends had been devastating. All the love and sacrifice I'd poured into raising him, all the support Robert and I had provided during his education and early career, all the family traditions and values we'd tried to instill, apparently meant nothing compared to his expectations about money and property. I'd spent the fall months wrestling with what to do about Kevin's behavior. Part of me had hoped that direct confrontation might shock him into recognizing how badly he was treating me. Another part had wondered if family counseling might help us work through our differences before they became irreparable. I'd even considered whether I was being overly sensitive, whether Kevin's focus on inheritance was simply practical planning, rather than disrespectful greed. But yesterday's Thanksgiving outburst had eliminated any remaining doubt about Kevin's character and priorities. His willingness to humiliate me in front of the entire family, to question my mental competency, and dismiss my worth as a human being, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating, entitled person my son had become. As I sat in my quiet kitchen that Friday morning, I found myself thinking about all the clients I'd counseled over the years who'd faced similar situations with their adult children. I'd seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes, elderly, parents manipulated into signing over assets they later regretted transferring, and children who'd destroyed relationships with their siblings fighting over money that hadn't even been distributed yet. In my professional practice, I'd always advised clients to maintain control of their assets until their deaths, to avoid making promises about inheritance that might create unrealistic expectations, and to consider their children's character and behavior when making estate planning decisions. I'd emphasized that inheritance was a privilege, not a right, and that parents had every justification for making decisions based on their children's demonstrated respect and responsibility. Now I was facing the most difficult application of my own professional advice. The theoretical had become painfully personal, and I was confronting the reality that one of my children had failed the most basic test of human decency. Kevin had shown me exactly how much he valued our relationship, and it was time I responded accordingly. The beautiful thing about being a financial planner was that I understood exactly how to structure my estate to reflect my true wishes while ensuring those decisions were legally unassailable. I knew which documents needed to be updated, which conversations needed to be had with my attorney and financial advisor, and which steps needed to be taken to protect my interests while I was still alive and competent. Kevin had made a critical error in assuming that his inheritance was guaranteed regardless of his behavior toward me. He'd operated under the mistaken belief that family obligation and traditional expectations would override any concerns I might have about his character. What he'd failed to understand was that his assumptions were about to collide with the legal reality of estate planning in the 21st century. I finished my coffee and reached for my phone to call Patricia Williams. It was time to schedule a meeting that would change the trajectory of Kevin's financial future in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. My son had spent years treating me like a senile old woman whose only value lay in what I might leave behind when I died. It was time he learned the true cost of that profound miscalculation. Patricia Williams answered her phone on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship mixed with professional concern. "Maggie, I wasn't expecting to hear from you this early on Black Friday. How did Thanksgiving go with the family?" The question hung in the air for a moment as I gathered my thoughts, still processing the emotional whiplash of watching my carefully maintained family harmony explode over turkey and stuffing. "Pat, I need to schedule an emergency meeting. Something happened yesterday that changes everything we've discussed about my estate planning." My voice remained steady, years of dealing with crisis situations as a school principal serving me well, but Patricia caught the underlying tension immediately. She'd known me long enough to recognize when I was operating in crisis management mode rather than casual conversation. Within 30 minutes, I was sitting in Patricia's downtown office, the familiar smell of leather-bound law books and fresh coffee providing an oddly comforting backdrop for what would prove to be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Patricia had come in specifically to meet with me, leaving her own family gathering to provide the legal counsel I desperately needed. The fact that she'd dropped everything to be there spoke volumes about both her professionalism and our friendship. I recounted yesterday's events with the precision of someone who'd spent decades documenting difficult situations for official records. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I described Kevin's escalating demands for financial control and his explosive accusations about my mental competency. When I reached the part about him calling me senile and worthless in front of the entire family, Patricia's jaw tightened visibly. "Maggie, I'm so sorry you had to endure that kind of verbal abuse, especially during what should have been a celebration with your family." Patricia's professional demeanor couldn't completely mask her personal outrage. Unfortunately, I can't say I'm entirely surprised. We've discussed Kevin's growing sense of entitlement during our previous meetings, and this kind of escalation often happens when adult children feel their expected inheritance is somehow threatened. The conversation that followed was both heartbreaking and liberating. Patricia walked me through the legal realities of estate planning, confirming what I already knew professionally but needed to hear personally. My assets were mine to distribute, as I saw fit, regardless of Kevin's expectations or assumptions. Birth order meant nothing in the eyes of the law, and traditional inheritance patterns had no legal standing if they conflicted with my clearly expressed wishes. More importantly, Patricia explained the concept of inheritance manipulation and how Kevin's behavior fit a pattern she'd seen countless times in her practice. Adult children who began questioning their parents' mental competency, demanding control over financial decisions, or making public claims about future inheritance were often laying groundwork for more serious challenges down the road. The fact that Kevin had made his accusations in front of witnesses actually worked in my favor if he ever tried to contest my estate planning decisions. "The question now," Patricia said, leaning back in her leather chair, "is what you want to do about this situation. You have several options, ranging from having another conversation with Kevin about boundaries to making more significant changes to your estate plan. But I want you to think carefully about your motivations and long-term goals before we make any irreversible decisions." I appreciated Patricia's caution, but my mind was already made up. Years of counseling families through similar crises had taught me that patterns of disrespectful behavior rarely improved without serious consequences. Kevin had shown me his true character, and I believed him. The question wasn't whether he deserved to inherit my life's work, but whether I was strong enough to make the difficult decisions his behavior demanded. That weekend, I found myself having parallel conversations with Linda and David that reinforced my growing clarity about the situation. Both of my other children called to check on me after witnessing Kevin's outburst, their concern and embarrassment about their brother's behavior evident in every word. Neither of them attempted to excuse or minimize what had happened, and both offered their support for whatever decisions I needed to make. Linda, ever the practical middle child, had been particularly direct in her assessment. "Mom, Kevin's been talking about inheriting the farm for years like it was already his. Jessica's been right there with him, making plans for money they don't have, and treating you like you're just keeping their property warm until you die." What happened at Thanksgiving wasn't a moment of anger. It was Kevin finally saying out loud what he's been thinking for a long time. David, with his social worker's training in family dynamics, had offered a different but equally disturbing perspective. I've seen this pattern in my work with elderly clients who are being financially exploited by their adult children. The verbal abuse, the questioning of mental competency, the attempts to take control of financial decisions, these are all classic warning signs. The fact that Kevin felt comfortable saying those things in front of the whole family suggests he's been testing boundaries for a while and getting away with it. Their validation of my concerns was both comforting and painful. It confirmed that I wasn't overreacting or being overly sensitive about Kevin's behavior, but it also meant acknowledging that one of my children had fundamentally failed to become the kind of person I'd hoped to raise. The little boy who'd once brought me dandelions and sought comfort during thunderstorms had grown into a man capable of cruelty toward the mother who'd sacrificed for his success. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I called Patricia first, then Michael Rodriguez at the bank, and finally Susan Baker, my financial advisor. I scheduled meetings with all three for the coming week, explaining that I needed to make significant changes to my estate planning and financial management structure. Each of them understood the urgency in my voice and made time in their busy schedules to accommodate what I clearly considered a crisis situation. The meeting with Michael proved particularly illuminating. As the bank manager who'd handled my family's accounts for over 15 years, he'd observed Kevin's increasing involvement in my financial affairs firsthand. Michael confirmed that Kevin had been asking increasingly detailed questions about account structures, investment performance, and even my monthly spending patterns during his visits to the bank. "Mrs. Thompson, I'll be honest with you. Michael said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing sensitive family matters. Your son has been asking questions that go beyond normal family concern about a parent's financial well-being. He's requested information that we couldn't provide without your written authorization, and he seemed frustrated when we explained our privacy policies. Some of his questions suggested he was operating under assumptions about his future access to these accounts that weren't consistent with your current beneficiary designations. This revelation added another layer to my understanding of Kevin's behavior. He hadn't just been making assumptions about his inheritance in casual conversation with family and friends. He'd been actively investigating my financial situation, trying to gather detailed information about assets he clearly considered his future property. The level of calculation behind his actions was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Susan Baker's insights proved equally valuable. As my financial advisor, she'd been fielding calls from Kevin for months, ostensibly seeking advice about his own investment portfolio, but invariably steering conversations toward questions about my accounts and financial strategies. Susan had maintained professional boundaries and client confidentiality, but she'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Kevin's persistent inquiries. "Maggie, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned earlier," Susan said during our Tuesday afternoon meeting. "Kevin called my office 3 weeks ago asking specifically about power of attorney documents and how they might affect management of your investment accounts. He wanted to know what would happen if you became incapacitated and couldn't make your own financial decisions." The questions were detailed enough that I wondered if he was consulting with someone about legal strategies for gaining control of your assets. The implications were staggering. Kevin hadn't just been counting on inheriting my wealth after my death. He'd been researching ways to potentially gain control of my assets while I was still alive, using claims about my mental competency as justification for taking over my financial affairs. The conversation at Thanksgiving suddenly looked less like an emotional outburst and more like a calculated attempt to establish a public record of concerns about my cognitive abilities. This realization transformed my understanding of what I was dealing with. Kevin wasn't simply an ungrateful son who'd developed an unfortunate sense of entitlement about his inheritance. He was someone who'd been systematically planning to take control of my life's work, with or without my consent. The verbal abuse at Thanksgiving had been the opening shot in what could have become a much more serious campaign to undermine my independence and autonomy. The documentation I'd been keeping of Kevin's behavior suddenly took on new significance. What I'd initially considered personal record-keeping for my own clarity had actually created a paper trail that could protect me from more serious challenges to my competency and decision-making authority. Every inappropriate comment, every assumption about inheritance, every attempt to control my spending or living situation was now evidence of a pattern that supported my right to make different choices about my estate. Wednesday's meeting with Patricia brought all these threads together into a comprehensive legal strategy. We reviewed the evidence I'd accumulated, analyzed the information from Michael and Susan, and discussed the various options available for restructuring my estate plan. Patricia's assessment was both reassuring and sobering. "Maggie, you're in an extremely strong legal position to make whatever changes you feel are appropriate," Patricia explained. "You're clearly mentally competent, you have excellent documentation of the problematic behavior that's motivating your decisions, and you have multiple professional witnesses who can attest to both your cognitive abilities and Kevin's inappropriate conduct. Any challenges to your estate planning decisions would face significant evidentiary hurdles." The conversation then turned to the practical mechanics of implementing changes to my will and related documents. Patricia walked me through various options for redistributing my assets, from completely disinheriting Kevin to leaving him a smaller portion while increasing the shares for Linda and David. We discussed charitable giving strategies, trust structures that could protect assets from future challenges, and timeline considerations for implementing changes. What emerged from our discussions was a comprehensive plan that reflected both my values and my assessment of my children's character. Linda and David had consistently shown respect for my autonomy and appreciation for the sacrifices Robert and I had made for our family. They'd built their own successful careers and financial stability without counting on inheritance to fund their lifestyles. They'd supported my decisions about charitable giving and lifestyle choices without trying to preserve their money for future distribution. Kevin, by contrast, had demonstrated that he valued my wealth more than my well-being, my assets more than my autonomy, and his financial future more than our family relationship. His behavior had shown a fundamental lack of respect for me as a person, viewing me instead as an obstacle to his own prosperity. The estate plan I'd been maintaining, which would have left him the largest share as the eldest son, no longer reflected my assessment of his character or my wishes for how my life's work should be distributed. The plan Patricia and I developed was both elegant and decisive. Kevin would receive a token inheritance that couldn't be challenged as evidence of mental incompetency or oversight, but the bulk of my estate would be redistributed to reflect my true priorities. Linda and David would receive larger shares, my charitable commitments would be significantly expanded, and specific provisions would be made to protect the family farmland from development or sale. Most importantly, the new plan included detailed explanations of my reasoning, documented with dates and specific examples of the behavior that had influenced my decisions. If Kevin ever attempted to challenge the will, he would face not only the legal hurdles of proving mental incompetency, but also the public revelation of exactly how he'd treated his mother during her lifetime. By Thursday evening, I'd signed new estate planning documents that reflected my evolved understanding of my children's character and my own values. The process had been emotionally exhausting, but also liberating. For the first time in years, my legal documents aligned with my true wishes rather than outdated assumptions about family loyalty and birth order obligations. Kevin, of course, had no idea that his Thanksgiving outburst had triggered such comprehensive changes to his financial future. He'd called twice since the holiday dinner, leaving voicemail messages that progressed from defensive justification of his comments to grudging apologies for getting a little heated during our family discussion. Neither message acknowledged the cruelty of his words or showed any real understanding of how deeply he'd hurt me. I didn't return his calls immediately. Part of me was still processing the emotional impact of watching my son reveal his true character, and part of me was strategically allowing him to wonder about the consequences of his behavior. Kevin was accustomed to having his apologies accepted quickly, his problematic behavior forgiven and forgotten in the interest of family harmony. This time would be different. When I finally called him back on Friday afternoon, our conversation was cordial but noticeably cool. Kevin attempted to minimize what had happened at Thanksgiving, characterizing it as a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand due to holiday stress and too much wine. He suggested we put the whole incident behind us and focus on moving forward as a family. I accepted his apology with the same grace I'd shown when he was a child, apologizing for breaking something valuable or hurting someone's feelings. But I also made it clear that some words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. The trust and respect that had been damaged would take time and consistent behavior to rebuild. Kevin seemed satisfied with this response, apparently believing that he'd successfully managed the fallout from his outburst. What Kevin didn't realize was that his apology, like his original attack, had been carefully documented. The casual way he'd dismissed his cruel words as a minor disagreement revealed as much about his character as the original outburst. Someone who truly understood the magnitude of calling their mother senile and worthless in front of the entire family would have shown more genuine remorse and made more serious efforts at making amends. As I hung up the phone after our conversation, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The difficult decisions had been made. The legal protections were in place, and the consequences of Kevin's behavior were now simply waiting to unfold in their own time. I'd spent my professional career helping other families navigate these exact challenges, and now I'd successfully applied that expertise to protect my own interests and values. The weekend passed quietly, giving me time to process the emotional upheaval of the past week while beginning to envision my future without the constant stress of Kevin's financial manipulation and disrespectful behavior. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life, rather than serving as the custodian of someone else's inheritance expectations. Sunday evening, as I prepared for the coming week, I reflected on how much had changed in just 7 days. A week ago, I'd been wrestling with growing concerns about Kevin's behavior, while hoping that family love and communication might somehow resolve our differences. Now, I was operating from a position of clarity and strength, protected by comprehensive legal documentation and supported by professionals who understood both my situation and my rights. Kevin had taught me an important lesson about the difference between unconditional love and unconditional enablement. I would always love the son I'd raised, but I was no longer willing to subsidize the man he'd chosen to become. My estate plan now reflected my actual values rather than outdated assumptions about family obligation, and I felt confident that I'd made decisions Robert would have supported if he'd lived to see Kevin's true character revealed. The most satisfying aspect of my new situation was knowing that I'd outmaneuvered someone who'd assumed I was too old, too trusting, and too emotionally vulnerable to protect myself from his manipulation. Kevin had underestimated the woman who'd raised him, and that miscalculation was going to prove very expensive indeed. But the lessons he'd learned from the consequences of his behavior would ultimately be far more valuable than any inheritance he'd expected to receive. 3 weeks had passed since Thanksgiving when I received the phone call that would set the final phase of my plan into motion. I was in my kitchen, preparing lunch and enjoying the peaceful quiet of a December afternoon, when my landline rang. The caller ID showed Kevin's number, which wasn't unusual since he'd been checking in regularly since his half-hearted apology. What was unusual was the tone of panic in his voice when I answered. "Mom, we need to talk. Something's happened, and I think there might be some kind of mistake with the bank." Kevin's words tumbled out in a rush, his usual confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "I went to First National this morning to ask Michael about setting up a business loan, and he mentioned something about changes to account, structures that didn't make sense. Can you meet me there this afternoon?" I set down my teacup carefully, buying myself a moment to process this development. Michael Rodriguez and I had discussed this possibility during our meeting 2 weeks ago. Kevin's increasingly frequent visits to the bank, combined with his detailed questions about my accounts, had prompted Michael to implement additional security measures on my financial records. Any attempts to access information about my accounts now required my direct authorization, and Michael had been instructed to inform me immediately of any such requests. "Kevin, I'm not sure what kind of mistake you think there might be," I replied calmly. "My banking relationship with Michael is quite straightforward. If you're having difficulty with your own loan application, perhaps you should discuss that directly with him rather than involving my accounts in the conversation. D." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Kevin finally spoke again, his voice carried an edge I'd been hearing more frequently in recent months. "Mom, this isn't about my loan. Michael said there have been changes to your beneficiary designations and account access authorizations. I think someone might be taking advantage of you. Maybe that financial advisor, or even Patricia Williams. You need to be careful about people who might try to manipulate older adults into making financial decisions they wouldn't normally make." The irony of Kevin warning me about financial manipulation was so profound that I had to suppress a laugh. Here was my son, who'd spent years trying to control my spending and decision-making, now expressing concern that other people might be influencing me inappropriately. The psychological projection was textbook perfect, exactly the kind of behavior I'd observed in dozens of family financial disputes during my consulting career. "Kevin, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that any changes to my banking arrangements have been made with careful consideration and proper legal counsel. My mental faculties are quite intact, despite your recent suggestions to the contrary. I let that observation hang in the air for a moment before continuing. If you have concerns about your own financial situation, I'm happy to listen. But my banking relationships are not appropriate topics for discussion. What followed was a conversation that revealed the depths of Kevin's assumptions about his role in my financial life. He'd apparently been operating under the belief that his status as my eldest son gave him some sort of inherent right to information about my accounts, investment performance, and estate planning decisions. The idea that I might make significant changes without consulting him first seemed genuinely incomprehensible to him. As Kevin's frustration mounted, his language became increasingly revealing. He spoke about family assets and our property in ways that made clear he'd long ago stopped thinking of my wealth as actually belonging to me. In his mind, he was already the rightful owner of everything Robert and I had accumulated, and I was merely the temporary custodian of his inheritance. Any decisions I made that didn't align with his expectations were, by definition, evidence of poor judgment or outside manipulation. The conversation ended with Kevin demanding that I accompany him to the bank the following morning to clear up whatever confusion had occurred. His tone suggested he expected me to comply with his request immediately, without question or delay. This presumptuous attitude provided the perfect opportunity to begin revealing the new reality of our relationship. Kevin, I won't be accompanying you to the bank tomorrow or any other day. My financial arrangements are private matters that don't require your involvement or approval. If you continue to have concerns about your own banking relationships, I suggest you address those directly with Michael during regular business hours. I paused, letting the firmness of my response register fully. I hope you have a good afternoon. I hung up before Kevin could respond, feeling a surge of satisfaction at having established clear boundaries for perhaps the first time in years. The conversation had confirmed everything Patricia Williams and I had discussed about Kevin's sense of entitlement and his fundamental misunderstanding of legal relationships between adult children and their parents. More importantly, it had given me valuable insight into how Kevin might react when he eventually learned about the changes to my estate plan. That evening, I called Patricia to update her on Kevin's growing agitation about my financial arrangements. She listened with the focused attention of someone who'd handled hundreds of similar cases, asking clarifying questions about specific statements Kevin had made and the exact language he'd used to describe his concerns. Maggie, this conversation confirms several things we've discussed about Kevin's psychological approach to your estate, Patricia observed. His assumption that he has a right to information about your accounts, his concern about outside manipulation when you make independent decisions, and his immediate leap to demanding you prove your choices to him all fit a pattern I've seen many times before. Patricia explained that Kevin's behavior was escalating in predictable ways as he sensed his control over the situation slipping away. Adult children who'd grown accustomed to having input into their parents' financial decisions often became increasingly aggressive when those parents began asserting their independence. The fact that Kevin was now involving bank personnel in his attempts to monitor my financial activity suggested he was preparing for more serious challenges to my autonomy. The good news, Patricia continued, is that Kevin's own words and actions are creating an excellent record of his inappropriate behavior. Every conversation where he questions your mental competency, every attempt to access information about your private accounts, every demand that you justify your financial decisions to him is evidence that supports the changes we've made to your estate plan. This perspective helped me understand that Kevin's escalating behavior wasn't a setback to my plans, but actually a crucial component of their success. The more aggressively he pursued control over my financial affairs, the more clearly he demonstrated exactly why I'd been right to restructure my estate planning to reflect his true character, rather than traditional inheritance expectations. Over the following week, Kevin's attempts to involve himself in my financial life became increasingly bold and inappropriate. He called Susan Baker's office directly, claiming to be concerned about my investment performance and requesting detailed information about account balances and recent transactions. Susan, properly trained in client confidentiality rules, refused to provide any information without my written authorization and immediately called to inform me of Kevin's inquiry. Kevin also contacted my insurance agent, asking questions about policy beneficiaries and coverage amounts. He reached out to the property management company that handled my rental agreements with the farmers leasing my land, inquiring about lease terms and renewal schedules. He even called my doctor's office, claiming he needed to discuss my cognitive health because family members were concerned about my decision-making abilities. Each of these contacts was inappropriate and, in some cases, potentially illegal. More importantly, each contact created a documented record of Kevin's systematic attempt to undermine my privacy and autonomy. The professionals involved in my financial and medical care were uniformly appalled by his behavior, and several offered to provide written statements about his inquiries if such documentation ever became necessary. Dr. Harold Chen, my physician, for over 15 years, was particularly direct in his assessment when I met with him for my annual physical in mid-December. "Maggie, I want you to know that your son's call to my office asking about your mental competency was completely inappropriate and potentially actionable. You're one of the sharpest 70-year-olds I've ever treated, and your cognitive function is excellent by any objective measure." Dr. Chen went on to explain that he'd dealt with similar situations before, where adult children attempted to create medical records of parental incompetency to support legal challenges to financial decisions. He offered to provide a comprehensive cognitive assessment and written statement of my mental competency if such documentation would be helpful for my legal planning. This conversation crystallized my understanding of how far Kevin was prepared to go in his attempts to control my financial life. He wasn't simply making inappropriate inquiries about my accounts and investments. He was actively trying to build a case for having me declared mentally incompetent so he could assume control of my assets while I was still alive. The implications were both frightening and infuriating. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Patricia Williams to discuss Kevin's escalating behavior and the potential legal implications of his actions. Patricia's office felt like a sanctuary as I recounted the week's events, each incident more disturbing than the last. By the time I finished describing Kevin's call to my doctor's office, Patricia's expression had hardened into the focused determination I'd seen her display in court proceedings. "Maggie, Kevin's behavior has crossed several important lines," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades protecting clients from exactly this kind of familial abuse. "Attempting to access your medical records without authorization, making false claims about your mental competency to healthcare providers, and systematically contacting your financial service providers are all potentially actionable behaviors." Patricia explained that we now had grounds for pursuing legal remedies beyond simply restructuring my estate plan. Kevin's actions constituted a pattern of harassment and potential elder abuse that could be addressed through restraining orders, cease and desist letters, or even criminal charges depending on how far he was prepared to push the situation. More importantly, Kevin's behavior provided ironclad justification for any estate planning decisions I chose to make. No court in the country would question my right to disinherit a son who'd been systematically attempting to undermine my autonomy and have me declared mentally incompetent for his own financial benefit. The next phase of my plan involved letting Kevin know, in no uncertain terms, that his behavior had been discovered and documented, rather than confronting him directly, which might prompt him to modify his approach or become more subtle in his manipulation attempts. I decided to let him reveal the full extent of his intentions before taking decisive action. I instructed Patricia to send Kevin a formal letter outlining the inappropriate nature of his recent contacts with my financial and medical providers. The letter carefully documented each incident, explained the legal and ethical violations involved, and demanded that he cease all attempts to access information about my private affairs. Most importantly, the letter served notice that his behavior was being professionally monitored and legally documented. Kevin's response to Patricia's letter exceeded even my worst expectations of his character. Instead of apologizing for his inappropriate behavior or acknowledging the boundaries that had been established, he doubled down on his position that his actions were justified by legitimate concerns about my well-being. He hired his own attorney and threatened to pursue legal action to have me declared incompetent unless I agreed to submit to a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The legal threat backfired spectacularly. Patricia immediately petitioned the court for a protective order, presenting the extensive documentation we'd compiled of Kevin's harassment and manipulation attempts. Dr. Chen provided a detailed statement of my mental competency, while Michael Rodriguez and Susan Baker submitted written accounts of Kevin's inappropriate inquiries about my financial affairs. The hearing was scheduled for early January, giving me the perfect opportunity to spend the holidays reflecting on how dramatically my family situation had changed in just 6 weeks. Linda and David, horrified by their brother's escalating behavior, offered their complete support for whatever legal actions I chose to pursue. Both of them provided statements to Patricia describing Kevin's years of inappropriate comments about inheritance and his increasingly aggressive attempts to control my financial decisions. Christmas morning felt different than any holiday I'd experienced since Robert's death. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around Kevin's financial anxieties or deflecting his inappropriate questions about my spending and estate planning. Linda and David's families joined me for a peaceful celebration that focused on gratitude, family traditions, and genuine affection, rather than the underlying tension that had characterized recent gatherings. Kevin and Jessica chose not to attend. Christmas dinner, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were really about the legal proceedings. Their absence was initially uncomfortable, like a missing tooth that your tongue keeps finding, but as the day progressed, I realized how much more relaxed and genuine our family interactions became without the constant undercurrent of Kevin's financial calculations. The court hearing in early January was both anticlimactic and completely vindicating. Kevin's attorney had apparently advised him that his legal position was untenable, given the extensive documentation of his inappropriate behavior and the professional testimony about my mental competency. Rather than proceeding with his incompetency petition, Kevin agreed to a consent order that prohibited him from contacting any of my financial or medical providers and required him to respect my privacy and autonomy in all future interactions. Judge Morrison, who'd handled hundreds of similar cases during her years on the family court bench, took the unusual step of reading Kevin a personal lecture about elder abuse and the legal consequences of attempting to manipulate elderly parents for financial gain. Her words were harsh but fair, making clear that Kevin's behavior had been not just inappropriate, but potentially criminal. Walking out of the courthouse that January morning, I felt a profound sense of liberation that I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. For the first time in years, I was free to make my own financial decisions without worrying about Kevin's reactions or interference. The legal protections were in place, the documentation was comprehensive, and the boundaries were clearly established. But the most satisfying aspect of the court proceedings was knowing that Kevin still had no idea about the changes I'd made to my estate plan. He'd been so focused on trying to gain control of my assets during my lifetime that he hadn't considered the possibility that his behavior might affect his inheritance after my death. The lessons he was about to learn would be far more expensive than anything the court could have imposed. That evening, I called Patricia to discuss the final phase of my plan. With the legal harassment resolved and Kevin's character thoroughly documented in court records, it was time to inform him about the new reality of his financial future. Patricia suggested that we arrange for Kevin to be formally notified of the estate plan changes, both to eliminate any future claims that he hadn't been adequately informed and to ensure he understood the direct connection between his behavior and its consequences. The meeting was scheduled for the following week in Patricia's office, with Kevin's attorney present to ensure there could be no misunderstanding about the legal implications of what he was about to learn. I'd waited months for this moment, and I wanted to savor every second of Kevin's realization that his assumptions about inheritance had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his relationship with his mother. The conference room at Patricia's law firm felt appropriately formal for what would prove to be one of the most significant conversations of Kevin's life. He arrived with his attorney, both of them clearly expecting some kind of settlement discussion or negotiated resolution to our family dispute. Kevin's demeanor suggested he still believed his legal maneuvering had been successful in establishing his concerns about my competency. Patricia began the meeting by reviewing the court order that had resolved Kevin's harassment of my financial and medical providers. She emphasized that Kevin's behavior had been legally inappropriate and that any future violations of the order would result in serious consequences. Kevin nodded along impatiently, clearly eager to move on to what he assumed would be discussions about my estate planning and his future inheritance. "Now," Patricia continued, "Mrs. Thompson has asked me to inform you of certain changes that have been made to her estate planning documents. These changes were made with full legal counsel, proper documentation, and comprehensive consideration of all relevant factors." Kevin leaned forward in his chair, his attention fully focused, for the first time since entering the room. I could see the expectation in his eyes, the assumption that whatever changes had been made were minor adjustments that wouldn't significantly affect his financial future. He was about to discover just how wrong that assumption had been. Patricia opened the folder containing copies of my new will and related documents. "Kevin, your mother has restructured her estate plan to reflect her assessment of her children's character and their demonstrated respect for her autonomy and well-being. Based on your behavior over the past several years, particularly your recent attempts to have her declared mentally incompetent, she has determined that you are no longer deserving of a significant inheritance." The silence in the room was absolute. Kevin's face went through a series of expressions as Patricia's words registered: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning comprehension of what he was hearing. His attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that this meeting was not going to proceed as his client had expected. "Under the terms of Mrs. Thompson's new will," Patricia continued, "you will receive a bequest of $50,000, along with some items of personal property. The remainder of the estate, including the family farmland, will be distributed to Linda and David, with substantial charitable bequests to organizations your mother has supported throughout her life." Kevin's reaction was immediate and explosive. He began shouting about unfairness, family tradition, and his rights as the eldest son. He accused me of being manipulated by outside influences and threatened to contest the will on grounds of mental incompetency. His attorney tried to calm him down, but Kevin was beyond rational discussion. I sat quietly through Kevin's outburst, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness for the relationship we'd lost and the person my son had chosen to become, but satisfaction in knowing that I'd successfully protected my life's work from someone who'd demonstrated such profound disrespect for the woman who'd created it. When Kevin finally exhausted himself and fell silent, I spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Kevin, you called me senile and worthless in front of our entire family. You spent months trying to control my financial decisions and questioned my mental competency to professionals throughout our community. You attempted to have me declared legally incompetent so you could take control of assets I spent a lifetime accumulating." I paused, making sure Kevin was listening carefully. "The inheritance you expected was based on the assumption that I would always love you unconditionally, regardless of how you treated me. You were right about the love, but wrong about the inheritance. I will always love the little boy who brought me dandelions, but I won't reward the man who called his mother worthless." Kevin left the meeting in a rage, threatening legal action, and making wild accusations about manipulation and family betrayal. His attorney followed him out, looking embarrassed by his client's behavior and clearly understanding that any challenge to my estate plan would be doomed to failure given the extensive documentation of Kevin's inappropriate conduct. Patricia and I sat in comfortable silence for several minutes after they left, processing the emotional intensity of the confrontation and the finality of what had just occurred. I felt drained, but also profoundly relieved. The difficult decision had been made, the consequences had been delivered, and Kevin now understood exactly how much his behavior had cost him. The months that followed were peaceful in ways I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Kevin made no further attempts to contact my financial or medical providers, apparently understanding that such behavior would result in serious legal consequences. He also made no effort to repair our relationship, suggesting that his interest in me had indeed been primarily financial rather than emotional. Linda and David were initially shocked by the extent of the changes I'd made to my estate plan. Both of them concerned that I might be acting out of temporary anger rather than considered judgment. However, as they reflected on Kevin's behavior over the years and witnessed his reaction to learning about his reduced inheritance, they came to understand that my decisions reflected a clear-eyed assessment of their brother's character rather than impulsive punishment. The family dynamics shifted in subtle but important ways. Holiday gatherings became more genuine and relaxed without the underlying tension of Kevin's financial calculations. Linda and David began calling more frequently just to chat. Their conversations focused on family news and shared interests rather than carefully avoiding topics that might trigger Kevin's anxieties about inheritance. Most importantly, I began to feel like I was living my own life again, rather than serving as the custodian of someone else's expectations. My charitable giving increased significantly, my travel plans became more ambitious, and I started taking classes at the local community college, simply because I was interested in learning new things. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based on my own interests and values, rather than worrying about how those decisions might affect Kevin's inheritance. The final validation of my choices came 18 months later when I ran into Jessica at the grocery store. Kevin's wife looked tired and stressed, and our conversation revealed that their marriage was struggling under the financial pressure of living beyond their means without the safety net of expected inheritance they'd been counting on. Jessica made several oblique references to Kevin's anger about my estate planning decisions and his ongoing belief that I'd been manipulated into making choices I would eventually regret. But the most telling part of our conversation was Jessica's complete lack of acknowledgement that Kevin's behavior might have contributed to his current situation. In her mind, I was simply being unreasonably punitive toward a son who'd only been trying to help me manage my affairs responsibly. The inability to recognize the inappropriate nature of Kevin's actions suggested that both he and Jessica had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of respect, autonomy, and family relationships. As I drove home from that encounter, I reflected on how much my life had improved since I'd stopped allowing Kevin's financial anxieties to dictate my choices. The decision to restructure my estate plan had been difficult and emotionally painful, but it had also been liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was now free to be generous with the people and causes I cared about without worrying about preserving someone else's inheritance. I could make decisions about my lifestyle and spending based on my own preferences rather than concerns about how those choices might affect Kevin's future wealth. Most importantly, I'd learned that unconditional love didn't require unconditional financial support. I would always love Kevin as my son, but I was no longer willing to enable his disrespectful behavior or subsidize his sense of entitlement. The boy who'd once brought me dandelions was gone, replaced by a man whose primary interest in his mother was financial. My estate plan now reflected that reality rather than outdated assumptions about family loyalty and traditional inheritance patterns. The $50,000 Kevin would eventually inherit was more than many people receive from their parents. But it was also a clear message about the cost of disrespecting the woman who'd given him life. Every time he looked at that check, he'd be reminded that his cruel words at Thanksgiving dinner had cost him nearly $2 million. That was a lesson in consequences and character that no amount of money could teach, but one that Kevin would carry with him for the rest of his life. 5 years have passed since that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, and the autumn air carries the same crisp promise it always has in Cedar Falls. I'm sitting in my kitchen this morning, preparing for another holiday gathering, but everything about this preparation feels different from those anxiety-filled years when I walked on eggshells around Kevin's expectations and financial calculations. The cranberry sauce simmers on the stove using my mother's recipe, the same one I've made for 30 years. But today, I'm making it for people who genuinely appreciate the love and tradition it represents, rather than viewing it as part of an inheritance they're already mentally dividing. Linda arrives first, as she always does, her arms full of contributions to our feast, and her face bright with the kind of genuine joy that comes from anticipating time with family you actually enjoy being around. Her children, now teenagers, bound into my kitchen with the easy familiarity of grandchildren who've never had to witness their mother being called senile and worthless at the dinner table. They hug me with real affection, not the calculating. Embraces of people mentally tallying their future inheritance. "Mom, you look wonderful," Linda says, and I can hear the relief in her voice that she no longer has to worry about family gatherings erupting into financial confrontations. "How are you feeling about hosting again this year?" She knows this is my first Thanksgiving dinner since the legal proceedings ended. My first attempt at recreating the family tradition that Kevin's behavior had nearly destroyed. David and Claire arrive shortly after, their presence filling my home with the comfortable energy of people who are genuinely happy to be here. David has grown into his role as my youngest son with a grace that honors both his father's memory and his own character. He helps me lift the turkey from the oven with the same gentle strength Robert once brought to these holiday preparations, and for a moment I can almost feel my husband's approving presence in the warm kitchen. The dining room table looks different this year, set for 12 instead of the 23 we once accommodated. Kevin's family is notably absent, their empty chairs creating space that initially felt like missing teeth, but now seems like room to breathe. Tyler and Madison, Kevin's children, are spending Thanksgiving with friends' families, their father's pride apparently preventing him from allowing them to visit the grandmother who betrayed him by refusing to subsidize his disrespect. As we gather around the table for our traditional gratitude sharing, the difference in atmosphere is immediately apparent. There's no underlying tension, no sense that someone is calculating the cost of every dish or viewing the family gathering as an opportunity to discuss financial strategy. Instead, there's genuine warmth, authentic appreciation, and the comfortable intimacy of people who truly care about each other's well-being, rather than their net worth. Linda speaks first, her voice steady with emotion as she talks about her gratitude for having a mother who taught her the difference between love and enablement. "I'm thankful that you showed me what it looks like to maintain dignity and boundaries even when it costs you something precious," she says, her eyes meeting mine across the table. "Watching you stand up for yourself these past few years has made me a better parent and a stronger person." David's contribution to our sharing circle reflects the social worker's perspective he brings to family dynamics. "I'm grateful for learning that healthy families don't sacrifice one person's well-being to enable another person's dysfunction," he says thoughtfully. "Mom, you could have kept the peace by continuing to accept Kevin's behavior, but instead you chose to protect your own dignity and teach all of us what respectful relationships actually look like." My own gratitude feels complex and layered as I prepare to speak. I'm thankful for the peace that comes with living authentically, for the freedom to make decisions based on my own values rather than someone else's expectations, and for the clarity that emerged from one of the most painful periods of my life. But I'm also grateful for the difficult lessons that have made my remaining relationships more genuine and my daily life more joyful. I'm thankful that at 72 years old, I finally learned the difference between being a loving mother and being a doormat, I begin, my voice carrying the strength that has grown from 5 years of living without Kevin's financial manipulation. I'm grateful for children who love me for who I am, rather than what I might leave behind, and I'm thankful for the wisdom to recognize that distinction before it was too late. The conversation flows naturally from there, touching on career developments, children's achievements, travel plans, and the ordinary concerns of people who are building lives based on their own efforts rather than inheritance expectations. Angela shares news about her promotion at the Minneapolis School District, while Claire talks about her work establishing a community health clinic for underserved populations. These are people who've created their own success and financial security, who view any inheritance they might eventually receive as a bonus rather than a birthright. After dinner, as we're clearing dishes and preparing dessert, Linda approaches me with a question that's clearly been on her mind. Mom, do you ever regret the decisions you made about Kevin and the estate planning? I know it must have been incredibly difficult to essentially disinherit your eldest son, regardless of how badly he behaved. Her question gives me the opportunity to reflect on something I've thought about countless times over the past 5 years. The decision to restructure my will wasn't made in anger or spite, despite how Kevin has chosen to characterize it. It was made from a place of clear-eyed assessment of character and a determination to ensure my life's work would be distributed in ways that reflected my actual values, rather than outdated assumptions about family obligation. Linda, the hardest part wasn't changing the will, I explain as we work together in the kitchen where so many important family conversations have taken place. The hardest part was accepting that Kevin had become someone I didn't recognize, someone whose primary relationship with me was financial rather than emotional. Once I understood that reality, the estate planning decisions became much clearer. I pause, considering how to explain the complexity of emotions involved in essentially disinheriting a child while still loving the person they used to be. I didn't change my will to punish Kevin for one bad Thanksgiving dinner. I changed it because that dinner revealed a pattern of disrespect and manipulation that had been building for years. He showed me who he really was, and I finally believed him. The conversation continues as we serve pie and coffee, touching on the broader implications of my decisions for family relationships and the lessons we've all learned about respect, boundaries, and authentic love. David observes that Kevin's absence from family gatherings has actually allowed the rest of us to develop deeper, more genuine relationships with each other. Without the constant undercurrent of his financial calculations and inheritance anxiety, we've been able to focus on the things that actually matter in family life. Claire, with her healthcare background, offers insights about the psychological aspects of Kevin's behavior and the patterns she's observed in families dealing with inheritance disputes. What strikes me about Kevin's approach, she says thoughtfully, is how he seemed to view Margaret's assets as already belonging to him, as if her role was simply to preserve his wealth until he was ready to claim it. That level of entitlement suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of parent-child relationships. The evening concludes with the same warmth and genuine affection that characterized the entire day, but as my family prepares to leave, Linda pulls me aside for a private conversation that addresses something we've all been aware of but haven't directly discussed. Mom, I want you to know that David and I have talked extensively about the inheritance situation and how it affects our own relationship with you, she begins, her voice carrying the seriousness of someone who's given this considerable thought. We never want you to feel like we're only maintaining our relationship because we're now primary beneficiaries of your estate. Our love and respect for you has nothing to do with money or inheritance expectations. This conversation represents exactly the kind of distinction Kevin had never been able to make. Linda and David's concern about being perceived as financially motivated reflects their understanding that genuine family relationships exist independently of inheritance considerations. Their ability to separate love from money demonstrates the character that Kevin had failed to develop despite the same upbringing and opportunities. I know that, I assure Linda, feeling grateful for children who understand that inheritance should be a reflection of love rather than a motivation for it. The fact that you're concerned about that distinction is exactly why the estate planning changes made sense. Kevin never showed that kind of awareness about the difference between loving me and wanting my money. As winter settles over Cedar Falls and I reflect on the 5 years that have passed since Kevin's Thanksgiving outburst. I'm struck by how much my daily life has improved since I stopped accommodating his financial manipulation and disrespectful behavior. The decision to restructure my estate plan was just the beginning of a broader transformation in how I approach relationships, decision-making, and the use of my resources. My charitable giving has increased significantly, freed from Kevin's constant criticism about giving away his inheritance to organizations he considered unworthy. I've established scholarship funds at the local community college, increased my support for the food bank and homeless shelter, and created an endowment for financial literacy education through the library system. These donations reflect my values and interests, rather than someone else's approval or disapproval. My lifestyle has also evolved in ways that prioritize my own happiness and well-being rather than preserving someone else's inheritance. I've taken several trips to visit Linda in Minneapolis and David in Chicago, exploring museums and restaurants without worrying about Kevin's complaints about unnecessary expenses. I've renovated my kitchen with new appliances and countertops, finally completing the project that Kevin had criticized as wasteful spending by someone my age. Most importantly, I've developed new friendships and activities that reflect my interests, rather than my role as someone's mother or grandmother. I've joined a book club, started volunteering as a financial literacy instructor, and even begun taking piano lessons, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for during my working years. These activities have enriched my life in ways that have nothing to do with family relationships or inheritance planning. The legal proceedings that resulted from Kevin's harassment and attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent have also had lasting positive effects beyond simply protecting me from his interference. The court order and documented evidence of his inappropriate behavior created a clear record that supports any future estate planning decisions I choose to make. More importantly, the process of standing up for myself legally gave me confidence to maintain boundaries in other areas of my life. Patricia Williams and I have maintained our professional relationship, with regular reviews of my estate planning documents to ensure they continue to reflect my wishes and circumstances. She's expressed admiration for how I handled a difficult family situation with dignity and strategic thinking, often referencing my case as an example of how elderly adults can protect themselves from financial manipulation by adult children. Dr. Chen continues to provide excellent medical care while serving as a professional witness to my mental competency and decision-making ability. His willingness to provide detailed documentation of my cognitive function has been invaluable in establishing the legitimacy of my estate planning choices. He's mentioned that my situation has made him more aware of signs of elder abuse and financial manipulation in his other patients. Michael Rodriguez at the bank has become not just a financial service provider, but an ally in protecting my autonomy and privacy. The security measures we implemented on my accounts have prevented any further attempts by Kevin to access information about my financial situation. Michael's professional discretion and support have been crucial in maintaining my independence while ensuring my assets are properly managed. The community response to my situation has been overwhelmingly supportive, with many people sharing their own stories of difficult family dynamics around inheritance and financial control. These conversations have helped me understand that Kevin's behavior, while personally devastating, was part of a larger pattern that affects many families dealing with aging parents and adult children who develop unrealistic expectations about inheritance. Several women my age have approached me at community events to express gratitude for how I handled my situation with Kevin. They've shared their own struggles with adult children who question their spending decisions, attempt to control their lifestyle choices, or make assumptions about future inheritance. My willingness to take legal action and restructure my estate plan has apparently inspired others to set better boundaries with manipulative family members. The impact on Kevin himself has been more complex and, frankly, less of my concern than it once would have been. From what I hear through community connections, he struggled financially without the safety net of expected inheritance he'd been counting on. His marriage to Jessica has reportedly been strained by the financial pressure, and Kevin's ongoing anger about what he continues to characterize as his mother's betrayal. Tyler and Madison, Kevin's children and my grandchildren, have been casualties of their father's pride and poor judgment. Kevin's refusal to allow them to maintain a relationship with me has deprived them of connection with their grandmother and deprived me of relationships with young people I genuinely care about. This aspect of the situation remains painful, but I understand that Kevin's need to maintain his narrative of victimization requires keeping his children away from perspectives that might challenge his version of events. Occasionally, well-meaning community members suggest that I should reach out to Kevin, that family relationships are more important than money, or that I should consider forgiving and forgetting for the sake of family unity. These suggestions, while kindly intended, reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happened in our family situation. The issue was never about money, inheritance, or family unity. The issue was about respect, dignity, and the right of elderly adults to maintain control over their own lives and decisions. Kevin's behavior crossed lines that had nothing to do with financial disagreements and everything to do with his willingness to abuse and manipulate his mother for his own benefit. My response to these suggestions has become more confident and articulate over the years. I explain that healthy family relationships require mutual respect and appropriate boundaries, that forgiveness doesn't require accepting ongoing abuse, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. These conversations have helped me clarify my own thinking while potentially helping others understand their own difficult family dynamics. The 5th anniversary of that terrible Thanksgiving dinner falls on a beautiful autumn day that reminds me why I've always loved this season in Iowa. The maple trees in my yard are brilliant with red and gold leaves, the same colors that decorated my table 5 years ago when my family last gathered in innocence and tradition. But today, as I prepare for another year of gratitude and reflection, I'm not nostalgic for those earlier gatherings that were built on false assumptions and unspoken resentments. Instead, I'm grateful for the clarity that came from crisis, the strength that emerged from conflict, and the authentic relationships that survived the test of financial pressure and disappointed expectations. My Thanksgiving table may be smaller now, but it's filled with people who value me for who I am rather than what I might leave behind. My estate plan may be different from what tradition might have dictated, but it reflects my actual values and the character I've observed in my children over decades of relationship. Most importantly, I'm thankful for learning that it's never too late to stop accepting unacceptable behavior, to set boundaries that protect your dignity, and to make decisions based on your own judgment rather than other people's expectations. At 72, I'm living more authentically than I have in years, freed from the exhausting work of managing someone else's entitlement and financial anxiety. Kevin taught me an important lesson about the difference between unconditional love and unconditional tolerance. I will always love the little boy who brought me dandelions and sought comfort during thunderstorms. But I refuse to subsidize the man who called his mother senile and worthless in front of the family she'd spent decades nurturing and protecting. The $50,000 Kevin will eventually inherit represents both a gift and a reminder. It's more money than many people receive from their parents, acknowledging our biological relationship and the love I once felt for the person he used to be. But it's also a permanent reminder that disrespecting your mother can be an expensive mistake, that assumptions about inheritance are dangerous, and that character matters more than birth order when it comes to distributing the fruits of a lifetime's work. As I look ahead to whatever years remain to me, I'm excited about possibilities that have nothing to do with family obligations or inheritance planning. I want to travel more, learn new things, deepen friendships, and continue supporting causes that matter to me. I want to live fully as Margaret Thompson, not just as someone's mother or grandmother or potential benefactor. The woman who sat in stunned silence 5 years ago as her son called her worthless has been replaced by someone who understands her own worth and insists that others recognize it as well. That transformation, more than any financial decision or legal victory, represents the true triumph of this difficult period in my life. Kevin may never understand the lessons his behavior taught me, but I'm grateful for them nonetheless. Sometimes, the most valuable education comes from the most painful experiences, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important things about ourselves. This Thanksgiving, I'm thankful for second chances, hard-won wisdom, and the courage to live authentically even when it costs something precious. I'm grateful for the family members who stayed, and the one who revealed his true character before it was too late to respond appropriately. Most of all, I'm thankful for learning that dignity is not negotiable, respect is not optional, and love without boundaries is not really love at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.